Okay, so I have played arms from 50 to 60, and then the Goblin event started. So I spent my time doing that. Before that, I was trying to figure out exactly how much more I wanted to do. So that's fine. Um, I have a build that I like that um, has seemed to be working. So my experience from 50 to 60 is, I feel like, more than enough to kind of go over everything. Um, I haven't really played Warrior a lot in the past to kind of know, like, this is the way things are now, this is the way things used to be. I don't know the ins and outs as well as I do with other classes. So, um, that and since Dragonflight has started, I have reset the talents for one reason or another several times now. So, um, I feel like looking at this from somewhat of a newer, um, kind of a newer player perspective, um, will be the best way to kind of go over everything. So it's going to be more in the style of the traditional state of. So not going to be resetting the talents and doing all of that. I'm just going to go over them in sections to go over certain things. So first of all, the spellbook. I have all the abilities. So the baseline warrior abilities. You have some kind of starter abilities until you get your better abilities at higher levels. Um, and then your arms abilities. The other thing is when I've played Warrior, I've typically played Fury because of Titan's Grip. I always like the idea of dual wielding two-handed weapons. And back with the old talent trees, that was the last talent in the Fury tree was Titan's Grip. So you knew if you saw a warrior that was dual wielding 200 weapons that one, they managed to get through their tree, and two, while looking for group was in the game, people still spam chat to form groups. So if they went through the trouble of going to a dungeon or raid to get a second two-handed weapon, that still took a bit of effort. So there was a bit of prestige if you saw a warrior wielding, dual wielding two-handed weapons. So that being said, arms is very good in PvP right now. So that was why I kind of wanted to play around with that, and the fact that I haven't really, I've set it up in the past. I've just never really done much with it. I think probably the most I've done was getting the artifact ability for it. Um, Probably might have done some PvP or something at some point. Um, so to go over the abilities, you have Colossus Smash, which if you take a talent becomes Warbreaker, which has a debuff effect. Warbreaker just makes the debuff an AoE effect instead of a single target effect. You have Overpower, which is going to be your filler ability. It's going to be the one you're going to spam the most. Mortal Strike is most likely what you'll spend Rage on. The main ability you'll spend Rage on. Um, Charge, of course. Execute, which you'll use if you don't use any of the other three damaging abilities. Impending Victory to heal. And then I took a couple abilities from the talents, Rend and Skull Splitter, which I will get into momentarily. Die by the Sword to have some damage mitigation. Bitter Immunity just to have a self heal. I haven't really died all that much. When I started out, my gear was not where it should have been, was not that great. So things were not scaling well. As I've gotten better gear, that was one reason why I did dungeons. Um, Things have started to scale better. I can kind of hold my own more now. Using a pending uh, victory is works more than enough as a self heal. Um, So I have no complaints there. It is good just to have a self heal as a backup though. Um, Stormbolt, Hamstring, which is your slow, Heroic Leap, Rallying Cry, Piercing Howl, um, Sweeping Strikes we'll get into in a moment, Whirlwind, Pummel. Yeah, so there you go. You can do some interesting things with the warrior talents. You can take Thundering Clap. You can take Ignore Pain. Tried Ignore Pain because I liked it for protection when it first came out. Um, I remember using it in Legion, and it worked really well. When I've looked at um, the healing from Recount on protection tanks, um, Ignore Pain is usually like one of the top abilities they use um, for some reason it counts as a self heal. Um, so I tried that and trying to use that in Impending Victory at the same time was just one too many abilities. So Impending Victory works perfectly fine, and in the context of a DPS is probably the better ability to be using anyway. So um, there's a couple things I would say about your baseline abilities. Colossus Smash, which turns into Warbreaker if you take a talent, um, is a weird ability, mostly because of the cooldown. It has a somewhat long cooldown for a DPS ability. Um, so it's really wonky to try to work into a rotation. So I usually use it as an opener and then just keep it on cooldown pretty much after that. Um, Overpower, I was kind of disappointed. It does not scale well unless you have somewhat decent gear. I remember using this at max level, and it was overpowered. It did massive damage in PvP and um, whatnot. And so getting two charges of it, which you could take with a talent. Don't remember if it was a PvP talent or a regular talent, but I do know you could take a talent for it. Was somewhat broken for how good of an ability it was. I think it in itself was a talent at one point, um, which it is also now. Um, I was kind of disappointed when I started questing. It didn't do more. That being said, Mortal Strike has worked perfectly fine. Between the cooldown and the rage cost, though, you don't get to use it as much as you would like. If you notice, Warbreaker and Overpower are the only two abilities that don't cost Rage. And I'm not including Skull Splitter for reasons that will become clear in a moment. Um, so Mortal Strike does, Execute does. Now you can spam Execute. There's some different talents you can take, and you will get procs for Execute. Um, and then, of course, if you're using Impending Victory at all, even though it costs 10 Rage, Rage is Rage. I wouldn't say I have any trouble generating Rage, which has kind of been one of the reasons why I didn't really care to play Warrior or Guardian Druid. Um, the Bear Druid, because I don't particularly care on how Rage works. And I know there's kind of an argument. There may be an argument there about, well, runic power works the same way. Kind of, yeah, you're generating something. Um, However, um, Death Knights are set up differently. They have more of a spell casting angle to them, so it's not as bad. Everything else in the game, mana, focus, energy, is something you're spending, and a lot of classes have a secondary resource you can generate as well, so it's not as big of a deal. Um, I don't really seem to have much of an issue generating rage. It's just now it's cooldowns and trying to figure out kind of what to use when. Um, of the two, Mortal Strike and Execute, Execute definitely is probably the priority to use. Um, Mortal Strike applies any of the base three. Um, Warbreaker, Overpower, or um, Mortal Strike. Um, well, okay, not Overpower. Mortal Strike, Warbreaker, and Bladestorm. I knew that didn't sound right. Will apply your Mastery, which applies a bleed, which usually ends up getting applied with Mortal Strike because of Warbreaker's cooldown. I'll use Warbreaker mostly for the uh, armor reduction effect, not so much for the damage or anything else. So I suppose having a 45-second cooldown, considering that, kind of makes it, kind of balances it out. Having two charges of Overpower definitely helps. It did not start out that way. Um, I thought I took a talent later on that, yes. Um, yeah. So I've ended up taking a talent that gave Overpower two charges, um, which I think was probably the better thing to do. Once I started, once I started kind of balancing out my gear so it was a little more appropriate with where my level was, um, Overpower started doing more damage. So between Overpower and Mortal Strike, I kind of was able to have a combo with my damage, and then, of course, when Execute procs, using Execute, and then some of the other abilities. So, um, not terrible. Um, just kind of takes some getting used to. If you're used to playing with Rage, if you're used to playing Warrior, probably is not that big of a deal. It just kind of takes some adjustment. Um, so as far as talents go, as I said, I want to kind of go over these in sections. So first are the AoE um, talents. I took two. Um, I took Fever of Battle. If Whirlwind hits two or more targets, it also slams your primary target. So Slam is a single target ability right there. It's usually just kind of a starter ability. Doesn't really do a whole lot, which is why I don't use it now. And it does cost rage, so it would just be one more ability kind of fighting um, over using rage. So, however, built into another ability like this, I actually kind of liked. So it actually works well. I knew using um, playing Outlaw using abilities like Blade Fury that um, Sweeping Strikes wasn't going to be enough. So I wanted something else. So this does a good job of kind of filling in when Sweeping Strikes is on in like the last few seconds of its cooldown, things like that. Or if the tank pulls another mob, um, kind of chain pulls. So you have another ability to do some AoE damage. So AoE cleave damage. Warrior tends to lean more towards cleave damage than AoE, so it kind of gets it kind of overlaps a bit at different points. So this works perfectly fine. And then I took improved sweeping strikes, which adds 6 seconds to its duration. So sweeping strikes turns your single target abilities into cleave abilities, which is an important distinction. Not AoE, just cleave. So they'll hit one additional target. However, that being said, they will work with all of your abilities. So as I um, talk about some of the other damage abilities that I took with the talents, just bear in mind that they all work with sweeping strikes. So between this and Whirlwind, which I get to use about 2-3 times before I run out of rage. depending on what point in the it's usually a dungeon when I'll use whirlwind. Depending on what point we're at, um, I'll be able to use it at least 2, 3 times, depending on how much rage I have. So I knew sweeping strikes wasn't going to be enough. Again, having used things like Blade Fury, so I wanted something else. So whirlwind works perfectly fine. These are perfectly fine. It helps keep my damage, my kind of my uptime on my damage. So um, they do together or separately. You do notice a increase in your damage, so they both feel like they're doing something. Um, After that, there's kind of a couple talents that I took kind of as a combo um, that maybe I wouldn't have normally taken on another class. I've been playing Rogue and Feral Druid, so kind of comboing abilities together is something I've been doing more lately, so I'm kind of more used to using certain things at certain times. Um, so this is what I'm calling kind of the Skull Splitter Bleed combo. So I was curious about this for the effect that it has. So it does damage and then causes your deep wounds and rend to expire instantly. So deep wounds is your mastery effect. Um, Mortal Strike, Warbreaker, and Blade Storm. Apply a dot on the target for 12 seconds and increase the damage the enemy takes from you by 10%. So that means that dot expires instantly, so it does all of its damage all at once. So I was curious about that, and then I looked at the talent below. Um, Tide of Blood replaces Skull Splitter, which I don't fully understand because it does the exact same thing. It just adds one effect to it. Skull Splitter deals 30% increased damage and also causes your rend to expire instantly. So it doesn't say anything about deep wounds. It still does the exact same thing with deep wounds. So it still has the same effect that the actual ability does. All it really adds, from what I can tell, is the increased damage. That was what I thought on when I was fighting actual targets. I went to a training dummy, got deep wounds, got rend, and when I used Skull Splitter, they both disappeared. So I'm assuming it's still consuming them both. Um, from the damage that I've been doing, I would assume that is a reasonable conclusion. And then from there, I was looking, and Rend, since both of these mentioned Rend, I was kind of curious, well, what is Rend? So it does physical damage, which is one of the better damage types you can do, and then places a bleed on the target. So I kind of like that idea of having bleeds, more like a warlock, but also being able to do more instant damage, kind of burst damage, kind of like a shaman. Your kind of comboing abilities, kind of like a rogue, like I said. So I was kind of interested. And what I like about Rend is once you use it and then you use Skull Splitter, Rend doesn't have a cooldown. So as long as you have the rage, you can reapply it and keep that uptime on using that bleed. So you can keep both your bleeds up even though you just consumed them um, with uh, Skull Splitter. So not too bad. Bloodborne, Deep Wound, Rend, and Thunderous Roar. Bleed effects deal 50% increased damage. So Thunderous Roar is a kind of an AoE bleed. Um, does instant damage and then places a bleed on targets within 12 yards. 1.5-minute cooldown. So not a bad kind of um, kind of burst damage, AoE damage kind of cooldown. Um, so these four together seem to work fairly well. So as I said, I will use Warbreaker as an opener for the damage or the armor reduction, and then overpower, Mortal Strike when I get the proc from or procs from Execute. Use that. Use Impending Victory when appropriate. So typically, as soon as I have, if I'm on a um, an elite, dungeon boss, um, I will use Mortal Strike to apply deep wounds, and then Rend, and then Skull Splitter. So you can typically use that combo maybe twice during any given fight, depending on how long the fight lasts. Um, After that, I wanted to go over what I use for execute. Um, so, as I said, there's talents you can take. They're the same talents that have been in the game for a while, so this really won't seem surprising if you've played Warrior um, at all. Um, execute no longer has a cooldown, and if your foe survives, 10% of the rage spent is refunded. Your attacks have a chance to make your next execute cost no rage, be usable on any target regardless of their health, and deal damage as if you spent 40 rage. So it normally is supposed to be a finishing move. Um, Only usable on enemies that have less than 35% health. Um, so with these talents, this talent, you kind of bypass that and it will kind of proc just repeatedly. So you can use this 3, 4, however many times you get that proc in a row, and it will proc often. So as I said, you'll most likely be using this to spend your rage um, as much or more than the other three abilities. Certainly more than Mortal Strike. Um, Execute doesn't have cooldown, so that is the one advantage. Um, and then Execute is usable on targets below. Now usable on targets below 35% health. I think it was like 20. That's usually what most finishing moves are in the game. Um, yeah, and then critical strike chance increased by 2%, and critical strike damage of Execute increased by 10%. And that 10% does seem to matter. I noticed a um, increase in my damage once I took this. So, yeah. So, outside of that, that is pretty much everything for the most part. As with other classes, kind of had to take some things I necessarily maybe didn't want for some things I did. Um, so I have one talent point for arms. Wasn't sure if I wanted to take Blade Storm or your Mortal Strike Cleave and Execute Critical Strike. Damage is increased by 10%. And your Execute has a 5% chance to critically hit, which wouldn't be terrible. Execute causes the target to take more damage from your Mortal Strike stacking up 2 times. Deep Wounds, Rend, and Thunder Short Bleed effects last 6 seconds longer and have a 5% increased critical strike chance. If you have Rend, Mortal Strike inflicts Rend on targets below 35% health. Oh, that's nice. I like that. Is Blade Storm the obvious choice here? I was going for more of a single target kind of PvP build, so Blade Storm wouldn't be terrible. I could still, because I wanted to get Executor's Precision at some point. So I'll go ahead and take Blade Storm for fine. Um, yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. Yeah, not really a whole lot to go over. Like I said, it's kind of um, redid this a few times. Got a build that I actually liked. As far as the arm talents go, the left side is more kind of your single target abilities. The right side is very much your AoE and execute abilities for some reason. Didn't really feel the need to take things like cleave, um, different talents like that. Ignore pain, like I said, I tried that, didn't really work all that well. Um, so yeah, so there you go, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope that was helpful for you, and thank you for watching.